Evolution has always been a gambler, throwing bizarre designs at the wall to see what sticks. Long before humans claimed dominion over Europe, another primate ruled its forests with an eerie familiarity that still unsettles scientists today. Picture a creature that walked like you, climbed like an ape, and stared with eyes that held an uncanny intelligence, yet lived in a world utterly alien to our own. This wasn't a distant cousin on some evolutionary side branch. This was something that came terrifyingly close to becoming us, then vanished without explanation. If you've ever wondered what Earth might look like if evolution had shuffled the deck just slightly differently, prepare to meet Oreopithecus bambolii, the swamp ape that rewrote everything we thought we knew about primate evolution. This creature looked so human in some ways and so alien in others that when its fossils were first discovered, scientists refused to believe it was real. The fossil that started a century of arguments. The coal mines of Tuscany weren't supposed to hide evolutionary secrets. In the late 1800s, miners digging through ancient lignite deposits kept hitting something strange, bones that looked almost human, but bent at wrong angles. These weren't the remains of medieval plague victims or ancient Romans. They were far older, pressed into coal seams that dated back 8 million years, long before humans existed anywhere on Earth. The bones sat in dusty museum drawers for decades because nobody knew what to do with them. They had hands that looked like they could grip tools, but the arms were too long. The pelvis suggested upright walking, but the feet looked designed for trees. Every anatomical feature contradicted the next, creating a biological puzzle that made no sense under any existing framework. When Arthur Keith examined the first complete skeleton in the early 1900s, he thought someone was playing an elaborate hoax. The proportions were all wrong for any known primate. The skull was flattened in ways that suggested intelligence, yet the face jutted forward like an ape's. The teeth were the strangest part, cusps arranged in patterns that didn't match anything living or extinct. Some molars looked designed for grinding tough vegetation like a gorilla's, while others had sharp ridges suited for slicing fruit or insects. Keith spent months measuring every bone, checking for signs of forgery, looking for evidence that some prankster had assembled parts from different animals. But the fossils were genuine, locked in geological layers that couldn't lie about their age. The scientific community split into warring camps almost immediately. One group insisted Oreopithecus was an early hominid, a proto-human that proved our lineage was far older than anyone suspected. They pointed to the pelvis, which had an unusually short and broad shape similar to modern humans. This structure would have shifted the center of gravity downward, making bipedal walking easier. The leg bones showed signs of muscle attachments consistent with upright posture. Even the foot, though strange, had an arch that could support body weight during walking. To these researchers, Oreopithecus represented a failed experiment in becoming human. Evolution testing out the bipedal design millions of years before our direct ancestors appeared. The opposing camp rejected this interpretation completely. They saw Oreopithecus as nothing more than a specialized tree dweller that happened to evolve some superficial similarities to humans through convergent evolution. The long arms screamed arboreal ape, not ground-walking primate. The curved finger bones looked perfect for grasping branches. The shoulder structure suggested an animal that hung suspended from trees rather than walking beneath them. These scientists argued that every human-like feature could be explained as adaptation to a specific lifestyle in the vanished forests of Miocene Italy, not as evidence of any connection to the human family tree. New fossils kept appearing throughout the 20th century, each one adding fresh fuel to the debate rather than settling it. A nearly complete skeleton discovered in 1958 showed Oreopithecus in exquisite detail and made the creature look even stranger. Its ribcage was barrel-shaped like a great ape's, suggesting powerful breathing muscles for vocalizations or sustained climbing. The spine had fewer vertebrae than most monkeys, but more than humans, creating an intermediate structure that fit no existing category. The hands were the most confusing element. The thumb could oppose the fingers for precision gripping. Yet the fingers themselves were so long and curved, they seemed designed for an entirely different purpose. Chemical analysis of the surrounding rock revealed something unexpected. Oreopithecus lived on an island. 8 million years ago, Tuscany wasn't connected to mainland Europe, but formed part of an isolated landmass called Tuscany, Sardinia. This island had broken away from the continent millions of years earlier, taking its fauna with it. Oreopithecus evolved in complete isolation, cut off from the evolutionary pressures that shape primates on the mainland. Island evolution is famous for creating bizarre forms: miniature elephants, giant rodents, flightless birds. In that context, Oreopithecus's strange mixture of features started to make more sense. It wasn't evolving toward humanity or away from it. It was evolving toward nothing except survival in its own unique environment. The teeth became a focal point of research because they preserved better than any other part of the skeleton. Under microscopes, researchers found wear patterns that told a story of dietary flexibility. The front teeth showed scratches from biting into tough plant material, bark, stems, or fibrous leaves. The molars had polish marks consistent with grinding seeds or hard fruits. Some specimens even had tiny pits, suggesting occasional insect consumption. Oreopithecus was an omnivore, able to exploit whatever food sources its island environment provided. This dietary adaptability may have been key to its long-term survival in an ecosystem with limited resources and few competitors. Decades of argument finally pushed scientists toward a consensus, though debate still flares occasionally. Oreopithecus wasn't a proto-human, wasn't an ancestor to anything living today, and wasn't even particularly close to the line leading to modern great apes. It was a bizarre evolutionary experiment isolated on an ancient island, free to develop in directions that would never have been possible elsewhere. The human-like pelvis evolved not for walking on African savannas, but for moving through dense swamp vegetation, where upright posture helped navigate flooded forests. The intelligence suggested by its brain case developed to solve problems unique to island life. Every feature that looked human was actually convergent evolution, nature arriving at similar solutions to different problems through completely separate pathways. Walking through water on two legs. The swamps of ancient Tuscany weren't gentle wetlands. They were maze-like tangles of half-submerged trees, floating vegetation mats, and murky channels where solid ground could vanish without warning. In this environment, walking on all fours like most primates wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. Weight distributed across 4 limbs meant sinking deeper into mud with every step. Oreopithecus needed a better solution, and evolution provided one that looked eerily human from a distance, but served an entirely different purpose up close. Its pelvis was the most obviously human-like feature, shaped in a way that allowed the torso to balance directly over the hips. In humans, this adaptation freed the hands for tool use and allowed efficient long-distance walking. In Oreopithecus, it served a completely different function: wading. With its body held upright, the swamp ape could walk through water that would have forced 4-legged primates to swim. The upright posture kept its head and chest above the surface, allowing it to breathe while moving through channels too deep for most animals. Its hands remained free to push aside vegetation, grab branches for support, or reach for food hanging over the water. The leg bones tell the same story. They were robust enough to support the animal's full weight, but lacked the specific adaptations seen in human legs. Our legs have a particular angle at the knee called the carrying angle that brings the feet closer to the body's centerline during walking. This angle makes bipedal striding efficient, by reducing the side-to-side sway of the hips. Oreopithecus had almost no carrying angle, meaning its legs descended nearly straight down from the hips. This created a wider stance, more stable in uneven terrain or shallow water, but less efficient for long-distance travel on solid ground. The animal wasn't built for marathon walking sessions. It was built for careful, deliberate steps through a treacherous environment. The foot structure reveals even more about its unusual locomotion. Human feet have a pronounced arch that acts like a spring, storing and releasing energy with each step. This makes walking incredibly efficient and allows us to cover huge distances with minimal effort. Oreopithecus had only a suggestion of an arch, a slight curve that provided some shock absorption, but nothing like the sophisticated engineering of human feet. Its toes were long and slightly curved, not straight and short like ours. These toes could grip surfaces, wrap around branches, or dig into soft mud for traction. The foot was a compromised design, capable of supporting the body's weight during upright walking, but retaining enough flexibility for climbing when needed. Scientists tested this bipedal hypothesis using biomechanical models built from laser scans of fossils. By reconstructing the muscles and calculating forces during different movements, they could simulate how Oreopithecus would have walked. The results were surprising. The creature could walk upright with reasonable efficiency, but its gait would have looked nothing like a human's smooth stride. Instead, Oreopithecus likely moved with a distinctive waddle, its hips swaying side to side with each step as weight shifted from one leg to the other. This waddling gait appears inefficient to modern eyes, but in soft mud or shallow water, it actually worked better than a human's narrow stance stride. The wider base of support prevented sinking and provided stability on unpredictable surfaces. The spine reveals another crucial adaptation. In most quadrupedal primates, the spine forms a horizontal bridge between the shoulders and hips, with muscles working constantly to prevent sagging in the middle. Humans evolved an S-curve spine that stacks the vertebrae vertically, reducing the muscular effort needed to stay upright. Oreopithecus had something in between, a slightly curved spine that wasn't quite as efficient as a human's, but far better than a typical ape's for upright posture. The vertebrae showed signs of powerful back muscles that could hold the torso erect for extended periods, suggesting the animal spent significant time in this position. The shoulders complicate the picture significantly. While the lower body seemed adapted for upright walking, the shoulder structure remained distinctly ape-like. The shoulder blades sat high on the back and angled upward, rather than lying flat against the rib cage, like in humans. This positioning is perfect for hanging from branches or reaching overhead, but awkward for the kind of arm swinging that accompanies human walking. When Oreopithecus walked upright, its arms probably hung at its sides or were held slightly out for balance, not swinging in the coordinated rhythm seen in human gait. The creature might have looked like it was constantly preparing to grab something overhead, even when walking on the ground. The fossil trackways tell the final part of this story. In a few locations, researchers found preserved footprints pressed into ancient mud that later hardened into stone. These prints show clear heel strikes and weight distribution patterns consistent with upright walking. The stride length suggests a slow, careful pace, nothing like the efficient striding of humans, but unmistakably bipedal. Some trackways show the footprints wandering erratically, suggesting the animal was foraging while walking, stopping frequently to examine vegetation or probe the mud for food. Others show straighter paths, possibly indicating travel between feeding areas or movement to avoid rising water. Hands made for a world that no longer exists. If you held the hand bones of Oreopithecus without knowing what animal they came from, you'd probably guess they belonged to something close to humans. The thumb was long and fully opposable, capable of touching the tip of each finger with precision. This kind of grip, called a precision grip, allows manipulation of small objects with fine motor control. Humans use it constantly, picking up a pin, turning a key, writing with a pencil. For a creature living 8 million years ago, having this ability was extraordinary. But the similarity ends there, because the rest of the hand tells a completely different story. The fingers were unnaturally long and curved like hooks. Each finger bone had a pronounced arch, creating digits that naturally curled inward even when relaxed. Modern tree-dwelling primates have similar fingers, shaped for wrapping around branches and supporting the animal's weight during climbing. The finger bones also had powerful muscle attachment sites, particularly on the underside, where flexor muscles would pull the fingers closed in a powerful grip. Oreopithecus could clamp onto a branch with enough force to hang suspended for extended periods, something no human could do without exhaustion. The hand was designed for gripping strength, not the gentle precision humans use for tool manipulation. The wrist revealed more contradictions. It had a structure called the radial styloid process that's considered a hallmark of great apes and humans. This small projection of bone allows the wrist to lock in an extended position, supporting body weight when walking on knuckles or climbing. In humans, it helps stabilize the wrist during tool use. In Oreopithecus, it probably served the climbing function, letting the animal lock its wrist while hauling itself through trees. But the joint itself was more flexible than a human's, with greater range of motion in all directions. This flexibility would have made the hand useless for the kind of power gripping humans employ when using tools, but perfect for the dynamic, constantly adjusting movements required in three-dimensional forest travel. Scientists studying the hand bones noticed something peculiar: asymmetric wear patterns. The bones on the thumb side of the hand showed more wear than those on the pinky side, suggesting the animal frequently gripped objects using a thumb and forefinger hold rather than a full hand grasp. This thumb-biased gripping pattern appears in modern primates that manipulate food items carefully, peeling fruit, stripping leaves from branches, or examining potential food sources. Oreopithecus was likely doing something similar, using its precision grip to process food in ways that required delicate manipulation. The arm proportions added another layer of strangeness. Oreopithecus had extremely long arms relative to its body size, longer even than most modern apes. When standing upright, its fingertips would have reached well past its knees, possibly almost to its ankles. These proportions are typical of animals that brachiate, swinging beneath branches using arm-over-arm motion like modern gibbons. But other aspects of Oreopithecus anatomy suggested it wasn't a dedicated brachiator. The shoulder structure didn't have the ball and socket mobility required for true brachiation, and the body was too heavy for efficient swinging. Instead, those long arms probably served multiple purposes. In the trees, they allowed the animal to reach between branches that were too far apart for shorter arm primates. On the ground, they could push aside dense vegetation or test the stability of floating plant mats before stepping onto them. In water, they could act like poles, jabbing into the substrate to gauge depth or providing additional support while wading. The arms were tools for environmental interaction rather than specialized devices for one particular form of locomotion. The shoulder blades preserved tiny ridges where muscles attached, and these ridges tell us about habitual movements. The muscles that pull the arm upward and backward showed particularly strong development, consistent with frequent overhead reaching and vertical climbing. The muscles that pull the arm downward and forward, used heavily in knuckle-walking apes, were far less developed. Oreopithecus wasn't knuckle-walking like gorillas or chimpanzees. It was spending significant time with its arms raised, grabbing overhead branches, possibly hanging suspended while feeding, or pulling itself upward through vertical tangles of vegetation. One remarkable fossil shows pathology that reveals both injury and adaptation. A partial hand skeleton from an adult individual has a healed fracture in one of the finger bones. The break occurred and then mended with the bone slightly crooked, creating a permanent deformity. But the individual survived long enough after the injury for significant additional bone growth to occur. The hand continued functioning despite the damaged finger, suggesting either that Oreopithecus could adapt its grip to compensate for injury, or that the other hand could handle tasks alone. Either way, it demonstrates behavioural flexibility beyond simple, instinctive responses. The teeth that confused everyone. When scientists first examined Oreopithecus teeth under magnification, they thought they'd been sent samples from multiple different animals by mistake. The dental patterns made no sense as a unified set. Some teeth looked designed for a gorilla's diet of tough leaves and bark. Others resembled the sharp-cusped molars of fruit-eating monkeys. Still others had features seen in insect-eating primates. The bizarre combination suggested either a dramatic mistake in specimen preparation or an animal with one of the most versatile diets ever seen in a primate. The answer, it turned out, was the latter. The front teeth, incisors and canines were the first clue to unusual behaviour. The incisors were broad and shovel-shaped, with thick enamel that could withstand heavy wear. These weren't the delicate nipping teeth of a fruit specialist, but robust structures built for tough work. Microscopic scratches on the enamel surface showed parallel grooves running from top to bottom, consistent with biting through fibrous materials while pulling upward or downward. Modern primates that strip bark or tear apart tough plant stems show similar wear patterns. Oreopithecus was clearly processing foods that required significant force just to break them down into edible pieces. The canines added to the confusion. In most primates, canines are weapons, long sharp fangs used in dominance displays and combat between males. Male baboons have dagger-like canines that can inflict serious wounds. Even female primates typically have prominent canines used for defense or threat displays. Oreopithecus canines were different, relatively small, not particularly sharp, and showing unusual wear patterns. Both males and females had similar-sized canines, suggesting these teeth weren't primarily used in social combat. Instead, the wear patterns indicated they functioned like incisors, helping to grip and tear food items. The reduced canines might reflect the relatively peaceful nature of island life. With fewer predators and competitors, elaborate weapons became unnecessary. The premolars presented another puzzle. These teeth, sitting between the canines and molars, typically serve as transitional tools, not quite as sharp as canines, but not as flat as molars. In Oreopithecus, the premolars had evolved into something unique, tall, cone-shaped structures with sharp ridges running along their edges. Under magnification, the ridges showed polish marks interspersed with tiny pits. This combination is diagnostic of a diet including both tough plant material and occasional insects. The animal was biting into hard objects regularly, perhaps seeds or nuts, while also consuming foods that left tiny chitinous fragments behind, insect exoskeletons. The molars were where things got truly strange. Most primates have relatively simple molars with 4 or 5 main cusps arranged in predictable patterns. Oreopithecus molars look like abstract sculptures with complex ridges swirling across the chewing surface in patterns that don't match any living primate. Early researchers counted the cusps repeatedly because they seemed to have too many. Later analysis revealed these weren't separate cusps, but extended ridges that folded back on themselves, creating a maze-like surface ideal for grinding tough, fibrous materials into digestible paste. Chemical analysis of tooth enamel provided insight into diet through an unexpected method: stable isotope ratios. Plants growing in different environments incorporate different ratios of carbon isotopes into their tissues. Animals eating those plants incorporate those isotopes into their bodies, including tooth enamel. By measuring the carbon isotope ratios in Oreopithecus teeth, scientists could determine what kinds of plants the animal had been eating. The results showed a mixed signal, some isotope values consistent with forest plants, others matching wetland vegetation, and still others suggesting the animal occasionally consumed plants from more open environments. Oreopithecus was eating whatever was available, switching between food sources as seasons changed, and different plants became abundant or scarce. Individual teeth from different specimens showed significant variation in wear patterns, suggesting different animals emphasized different food sources based on local availability or individual preference. Some skulls had heavily worn molars with smooth, polished surfaces indicating years of grinding tough vegetation. Others had molars with sharper cusps showing less wear, possibly indicating younger individuals or animals living in areas with more tender plant growth. A few specimens showed extremely heavy wear on the front teeth, but relatively pristine molars, suggesting they spent significant time processing food with their incisors and canines before it even reached the grinding surfaces farther back. The pattern of tooth eruption added another piece to the puzzle. Oreopithecus took years to develop its full adult dentition, with the third molars, wisdom teeth, not erupting until the animal was nearly full grown. This extended development period suggests a prolonged childhood, which in primates typically correlates with increased intelligence and complex social learning. Young Oreopithecus probably spent years learning from adults which plants were edible, how to process tough foods, and where to find seasonal resources. The dental evidence hints at behavioural sophistication beyond simple, instinctive feeding. One particularly well-preserved skull showed something extraordinary: dental disease. Several molars had cavities, actual holes worn through the enamel into the softer dentine beneath. These cavities formed during life, not after death, and the surrounding bone showed signs of infection. The individual probably experienced significant pain, yet it survived long enough for the infection to trigger bone remodeling around the affected teeth. This suggests either that Oreopithecus had remarkable pain tolerance or that its social group provided support, possibly sharing food with the injured individual. Evidence of care for sick or injured group members would indicate social complexity rare in fossil primates. The wear patterns also revealed information about feeding mechanics. The direction and depth of scratches on tooth surfaces showed that Oreopithecus had a complex chewing motion combining grinding and crushing. The jaw didn't simply move up and down like a nutcracker, but also slid side to side, using the ridged molar surfaces to pulverize food between opposing teeth. This sophisticated chewing mechanism appears in modern primates that eat tough, low-quality foods, requiring extensive processing. Oreopithecus was extracting maximum nutrition from difficult food sources, a strategy that probably helped it survive on an island with limited dietary options. Island evolution at its strangest. Tuscany 8 million years ago was an evolutionary playground operating under rules that would never work on continents. The island had broken away from mainland Europe millions of years earlier, taking with it a random assortment of animals that happened to be present when the split occurred. Cut off from outside gene flow and freed from many predators and competitors, these animals began evolving in bizarre directions. Oreopithecus was just one player in this strange ecosystem, but it exemplified the weird creativity that island evolution produces when nature gets isolated to laboratory conditions. The island itself was small by continental standards, roughly the size of modern Sicily, but large enough to support diverse habitats. Mountain ranges formed a backbone down the centre, with slopes dropping toward extensive coastal wetlands. The climate was warmer and wetter than modern Tuscany, creating lush vegetation that covered nearly every available surface. But resources weren't unlimited. The island could only support so many large animals, and competition for food, water, and nesting sites shaped evolution in powerful ways. Other animals shared this isolated ecosystem, and their fossils reveal just how strange island evolution can become. There was a giant hedgehog called Deinogallerix, larger than most modern rabbits, with teeth adapted for eating anything it could catch or scavenge. While mainland hedgehogs stayed small and specialized on insects, this island species grew enormous and generalized, filling the role typically occupied by medium-sized predators. Its fossils show it had lost most of the defensive spines that protect mainland hedgehogs. Without major predators, defense became less important than mobility and feeding efficiency. There was also a bizarre hamster relative called hattermice that reached the size of a large rat. On continents, hamsters stay small to avoid predators and exploit resources that larger animals can't reach. On the island, size constraints relaxed. Hattermice evolved longer legs for running, more robust teeth for processing tougher foods, and lost much of the burrowing specialization that defines mainland hamsters. It probably spent most of its time above ground, feeding on vegetation and fruits in environments where no large predators threatened it. The absence of large predators was the most significant feature of this ecosystem. Mainland Europe at the same time hosted saber-toothed cats, bear dogs, and hyena relatives, formidable carnivores that could kill any primate. The island had none of these. The largest predator was probably a medium-sized crocodilian that hunted in the wetlands, dangerous to unwary animals, but not a constant threat in drier habitats. Without predation pressure shaping evolution, Oreopithecus could afford traits that would be deadly liabilities on the mainland. The upright walking strategy makes more sense in this predator-free context. On continents, bipedal primates needed to be fast runners to escape danger. Oreopithecus didn't need speed. It needed versatility in navigating its complex wetland environment. The waddling, inefficient gait that would have made it easy prey on the mainland was perfectly adequate on an island where nothing was chasing it. Evolution optimized for environmental navigation rather than predator avoidance. The reduced canine teeth tell the same story. Mainland primates need large canines for defense and dominance fighting. Island populations often lose these weapons when predation pressure drops. Oreopithecus males didn't need dagger-like fangs to establish dominance because the stakes of male competition were lower. With abundant food and fewer animals competing for it, aggressive encounters probably resolved through displays rather than combat. The small canines suggest a relatively peaceful social structure compared to mainland primates. The diverse diet also reflects island constraints. Mainland primates can specialize. Fruit specialists follow fruiting trees, leaf specialists find forests with appropriate foliage. Island animals can't afford specialization because resources are limited and seasonal. Oreopithecus evolved to eat nearly anything: leaves, fruits, seeds, bark, insects, possibly even aquatic vegetation from the wetlands. This dietary flexibility was crucial for surviving on an island where any particular food source might fail during bad years. Island ecosystems are also prone to dramatic changes. Sea levels rose and fell with global climate patterns, periodically reconnecting the island to the mainland or isolating it further. During reconnection events, mainland animals could invade, bringing competition and predation. Fossils suggest this happened at least once during Oreopithecus's existence. Remains of mainland deer appear in layers that also contain Oreopithecus, indicating a temporary land bridge. But the swamp ape survived these invasions, probably by retreating into wetland habitats that mainland invaders couldn't exploit effectively. The plant fossils preserved alongside Oreopithecus reveal a rich but seasonally variable environment. During wet seasons, the swamps expanded, covering much of the lowlands in shallow water dense with vegetation. Palms, ferns, and early relatives of modern mangroves created tangled forests where solid ground was rare. During dry seasons, the water level dropped, exposing mudflats and creating more open woodlands. Oreopithecus had to adapt to these seasonal extremes, switching between aquatic and terrestrial lifestyles as the environment shifted around it. Volcanic activity added another challenge. The island sat on geologically active terrain, with periodic eruptions dumping ash across the landscape. Layers of volcanic ash appear throughout the fossil deposits, some thick enough to suggest catastrophic events that killed vegetation and disrupted ecosystems. Oreopithecus somehow survived these disasters, perhaps by having a flexible enough diet to switch to whatever plants recovered first after eruptions. The ability to eat nearly anything would have been crucial during recovery periods when preferred foods weren't available. The isolation eventually became a death sentence. Island populations are vulnerable to extinction because they have small total numbers, limited genetic diversity, and nowhere to retreat if conditions deteriorate. When climate patterns shifted dramatically around 7 million years ago, Mediterranean islands underwent severe environmental changes. Some became more arid, losing their wetland habitats. Others were submerged as sea levels rose. The Tuscany-Sardinia island fragmented further, creating smaller land masses that couldn't support large animal populations. Oreopithecus, specialized for wetland life and unable to migrate to more favorable environments, disappeared from the fossil record. The last specimens date to about 7 million years ago, and then there's nothing. An entire lineage gone. The brain that almost worked. Skull casts preserve the general shape of Oreopithecus's brain, and what they reveal is both fascinating and frustrating. The brain wasn't large by modern primate standards, roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's brain, but in a body that was significantly smaller. Relative to body size, this gave Oreopithecus one of the more impressive brain-to-body ratios of any Miocene primate. But size alone doesn't tell us much about intelligence. What matters is the structure, the organization of different brain regions, and how those regions relate to behavior. That's where the fossil evidence becomes maddeningly incomplete. The frontal lobes, the region at the front of the brain associated with planning, problem-solving, and complex behavior, were relatively large. Not as expanded as in modern great apes or humans, but significantly bigger than in most primates of the Miocene period. The skull bones show impressions where blood vessels supplied the frontal regions, and these vessels were larger than typical for a primate of this size. Large blood vessels suggest high metabolic activity, meaning the frontal lobes were probably burning significant energy. Energetically expensive brain tissue doesn't evolve unless it provides survival benefits, so Oreopithecus was presumably using that frontal lobe expansion for something important. The temporal lobes, regions involved in processing social information, memory, and complex visual stimuli, also showed expansion. These areas help primates recognize individuals, remember social relationships, and navigate complex social hierarchies. In modern primates, large temporal lobes correlate strongly with group size and social complexity. Individuals living in large groups with intricate social dynamics need bigger temporal lobes to track who's allied with whom, who owes favors, and who poses threats. Oreopithecus's expanded temporal lobes hint at a more complex social life than simple solitary foraging would require. The occipital lobe, the visual processing center at the back of the brain, was proportionally smaller than in modern tree-dwelling primates. This initially seems paradoxical. An animal that spent significant time climbing should need excellent vision to judge distances and spot branches. But the reduced visual cortex might reflect the island environment. With fewer predators to watch for and a relatively predictable ecosystem, Oreopithecus may not have needed the constant visual vigilance required on the mainland. Or perhaps other senses became more important. Hearing for detecting the rare predators that did exist, or smell for locating food in dense vegetation. The cerebellum, the region at the base of the brain that coordinates movement, was large and well developed. This makes sense for an animal with complex locomotion switching between bipedal walking, vertical climbing, and careful navigation of unstable substrates. The cerebellum integrates sensory information with motor commands, allowing smooth, coordinated movement. A large cerebellum suggests Oreopithecus had fine motor control and could perform complex movement sequences requiring precise timing. This would have been essential for navigating swamp environments where each step needed careful placement and weight distribution. One intriguing feature visible in skull casts is the expansion of areas associated with the sense of touch. Primates process tactile information from hands and face in specific regions of the parietal lobe, and these regions were notably enlarged in Oreopithecus. This suggests the hands were providing detailed sensory feedback, exactly what you'd expect in an animal using precision grip to manipulate food items. The expanded tactile processing areas indicate that Oreopithecus wasn't just grabbing things randomly, but was carefully feeling textures, testing resistance, and adjusting grip based on tactile feedback. This level of sensory integration implies cognitive sophistication beyond simple stimulus-response behaviours. The endocranial volume, the total space inside the skull where the brain sat, measured approximately 400 cubic centimetres. For comparison, modern chimpanzees have brains around 400 to 500 cubic centimetres, while early hominids like Australopithecus had brains of similar size. But Oreopithecus weighed significantly less than either chimps or Australopithecines, meaning its brain represented a larger proportion of total body mass. High brain-to-body ratios are metabolically expensive. Brains consume huge amounts of energy relative to their size. Oreopithecus was investing a significant portion of its daily caloric intake into maintaining that brain, suggesting strong selective pressure for intelligence. The question becomes, intelligent for what? Tool use seems unlikely given the lack of archaeological evidence and the hand structure unsuited for power gripping. But intelligence serves many purposes beyond tool manipulation. Social intelligence allows navigation of complex group dynamics, forming alliances, remembering individual relationships. Ecological intelligence helps track seasonal resources, remember locations of productive feeding sites, and learn which foods are safe or dangerous. Technical intelligence enables solving physical problems, how to reach food in difficult locations, how to process tough plant materials, and how to navigate tricky terrain. Oreopithecus probably needed all three types. Its social intelligence would have helped maintain group cohesion in an environment where cooperation might provide advantages, group defense against crocodiles, shared knowledge about seasonal resources, communal care of juveniles. Its ecological intelligence would have been crucial for surviving seasonal fluctuations in an island ecosystem with limited resources. Its technical intelligence would have enabled the complex locomotion and food processing behaviours that its anatomy suggests. Some researchers argue that Oreopithecus shows evidence of lateralization, preferential use of one side of the brain over the other. In modern primates, lateralization often manifests as handedness, with individuals preferring to use one hand for fine motor tasks. Skulls showing asymmetric development of the motor control regions would suggest handedness, but the fossil evidence is ambiguous. Some specimens show slight asymmetry, others don't. If Oreopithecus was lateralized, it would indicate specialized motor control development, another marker of behavioral sophistication. But without clearer evidence, this remains speculative. The structure of the inner ear provides unexpected insights into behavior. The semicircular canals, fluid-filled structures that sense rotation and help maintain balance, were relatively large in Oreopithecus. Large semicircular canals indicate an animal that performs rapid head movements or moves through three-dimensional space in complex ways. This fits with an animal climbing through tangled vegetation, where head position constantly changes. It also suggests Oreopithecus had good spatial awareness and could accurately judge its position even while moving through disorienting environments. When males and females live different lives. Dimorphism, the difference in size and shape between males and females of the same species, tells stories about behavior, mating systems, and social structure. In species where males compete violently for females, males evolve to be much larger, with weapons like horns or enlarged canines. In species where males and females form pair bonds and cooperate in raising offspring, size differences are minimal. Oreopithecus falls somewhere between these extremes, with patterns that reveal a complex social structure unlike anything seen in modern primates. Male Oreopithecus specimens were noticeably larger than females, perhaps 20 to 30% heavier on average. This size difference is significant but not extreme. For comparison, male gorillas are twice the size of females, while in monogamous gibbons, males and females are nearly identical in size. The moderate sexual dimorphism in Oreopithecus suggests a mating system involving some male competition, but not the intense, violent battles seen in the most extremely dimorphic species. Males probably competed for access to females, but through displays and posturing, rather than combat to the death. The canine teeth, typically the most sexually dimorphic feature in primates, showed surprisingly little difference between sexes. Both males and females had relatively small canines that functioned primarily as food processing tools, rather than weapons. This is unusual. Even in primates with moderate sexual dimorphism, males typically retain enlarged canines for threat displays and fighting. The lack of canine dimorphism in Oreopithecus suggests either that male competition wasn't primarily based on fighting, or that some other factor made large canines disadvantageous even for competing males. The pelvis showed clear differences beyond just size. Female pelvises had wider birth canals, necessary for giving birth to offspring with relatively large heads. The expanded brain size in Oreopithecus would have required larger birth canals than in similar-sized primates with smaller brains. But the female pelvis also had some structural differences that related to locomotion. The wider pelvis would have affected bipedal walking efficiency, probably making females slightly less stable during upright walking than males. This might have resulted in behavioural differences, with females spending more time in trees where pelvic width matters less, while males spent more time on the ground where their narrower pelvises provided better balance. The arm proportions showed subtle sexual differences as well. Males tended to have slightly longer arms relative to body size compared to females. This could reflect different behavioural patterns. Perhaps males range more widely through the environment, requiring longer reach to access resources across larger territories. Or perhaps males spent more time in trees despite their larger size, using their longer arms to move between branches. The evidence is too limited to say definitively, but the difference suggests males and females were using their habitats somewhat differently. Fossil sites that preserve multiple individuals sometimes show sex-based grouping patterns. At several locations, researchers found clusters of female skeletons with juveniles, while males were more dispersed throughout the site. This pattern suggests possible matriarchal groups, where females formed the stable social core, while males were more solitary or peripheral. Modern primates show similar patterns in species where females maintain lifelong bonds with relatives, while males disperse after reaching maturity. If Oreopithecus followed this pattern, females would have provided social stability and knowledge transfer across generations, while males competed for temporary access to female groups. Growth patterns differed between sexes as well. Analysis of bone growth rings, similar to tree rings, showed that males took longer to reach full adult size. Females achieved most of their growth within the first 5 to 7 years of life, while males continued growing for 10 to 12 years. This extended male growth period suggests a prolonged adolescence, where young males had to wait years before being large enough to compete with adult males for mates. During this adolescent period, they probably remained on the social periphery, observing adult behaviours and developing skills needed for eventual competition. The postcranial skeletons, everything below the skull, showed subtle differences in muscle attachment sites. Females had more robust muscle attachments in the upper arms and shoulders, suggesting powerful pulling strength. Males had more developed muscle sites in the back and legs, suggesting emphasis on postural control and bipedal locomotion. These differences hint at a division of labour. Females perhaps spent more time foraging in trees, using arm strength to pull themselves through branches and hang while feeding. Males perhaps spent more time on the ground, using their bipedal abilities to patrol territories or move between female groups. Some specimens preserve injuries that reveal behavioural differences. Several male skulls show healed fractures of the jaw and facial bones, injuries consistent with fighting or aggressive encounters. Female skulls rarely show similar damage. This pattern strongly suggests that males engaged in competitive aggression, while females generally avoided violent confrontations. However, the injuries on males were all healed, indicating the fights weren't typically fatal. Male competition was ritualized enough to establish dominance without killing, a pattern that reduces the costs of sexual selection on population survival. The implications of these patterns are fascinating. Oreopithecus apparently had a social system where females formed stable groups based on kinship, young were raised communally within these groups, and males competed for periodic access to females. This isn't the gorilla model where one male monopolizes multiple females. It's not the chimpanzee model where males form coalitions and females are solitary. It's something unique, or at least something that doesn't survive in any modern primate. The system probably evolved in response to the island environment, where resources were patchy and seasonal, making it advantageous for females to cooperate while males range more widely in search of opportunities. The juveniles that tell the real story. Baby skeletons are rare in the fossil record. Young animals have fragile bones that don't preserve well, and small bodies are more likely to be completely consumed by scavengers. But a handful of juvenile Oreopithecus specimens exist, and they reveal aspects of behaviour and development invisible in adult fossils. These young individuals show how Oreopithecus grew, how long childhood lasted, and how much learning was required before a young swamp ape could survive independently. The answers challenge assumptions about primate development and hint at surprising sophistication. The youngest confirmed Oreopithecus specimen is an infant estimated to have died within weeks of birth. Its bones were incredibly fragile, still primarily cartilage that would later ossify into solid bone. The skull was disproportionately large relative to the body, about 30% of total body size compared to roughly 20% in adults. This large head-to-body ratio is typical of primates born with relatively developed brains. Unlike many mammals that are born helpless with minimal brain function, primates tend to be born with more neural development already complete, allowing quicker learning and earlier social interaction. The limb proportions of juveniles differed noticeably from adults. Young Oreopithecus had relatively shorter arms and longer legs than adults, proportions that gradually shifted as they matured. The short arms in infants made sense from a developmental perspective. Mothers needed to carry their babies, and shorter arms were easier to manage while climbing and moving through the environment. As juveniles grew and became independent, their arms lengthened dramatically, eventually exceeding adult leg length and providing the reach needed for complex arboreal locomotion. Tooth eruption patterns provided a timeline for development. Like modern primates, Oreopithecus had two sets of teeth: deciduous baby teeth that emerged early and permanent adult teeth that replaced them gradually over years. By examining which teeth had erupted in different juvenile specimens, scientists could estimate ages and construct a developmental timeline. The patterns revealed that Oreopithecus took approximately 7 to 10 years to reach full adult dentition, a prolonged childhood comparable to modern great apes and suggesting extended parental care. Extended childhood in mammals typically correlates with two factors: large brains and complex behaviours that require learning. The brain development requires extended time because neurons need years to form proper connections. Complex behaviours require extended childhood because young animals learn by observing and practicing. Oreopithecus apparently needed both. Its relatively large brain took years to develop fully, and its unusual locomotion and dietary flexibility required extensive learning that couldn't be accomplished through instinct alone. One juvenile specimen preserved part of the pelvis, and it showed something remarkable. The individual had a congenital deformity of the hip joint. The bone had developed abnormally, creating a malformed socket that would have made walking painful and difficult. Yet the individual survived long enough to reach an estimated age of 5 or 6 years. The deformed bones show extensive remodeling where the body attempted to compensate for the abnormal structure. This individual couldn't have survived without social support. Adults must have tolerated its slower movement, possibly shared food, and protected it from dangers it couldn't escape quickly. This hints at compassionate behaviour rarely evidenced in fossil primates. Growth rings in juvenile bones revealed inconsistent growth rates. Some years showed thick bands of new bone, others showed barely any growth. This pattern indicates variable nutrition. During good years with abundant food, young Oreopithecus grew rapidly. During bad years, growth nearly stopped as the body diverted all available energy to basic survival. The variable growth patterns suggest that juvenile survival was highly dependent on environmental conditions. Island ecosystems have notoriously unstable resource availability, and juvenile mortality probably spiked during drought years or after volcanic eruptions disrupted plant growth. The brain development in juveniles followed an interesting pattern. Using CT scanning on juvenile skulls, researchers could estimate brain volume at different ages. The results showed that brain growth was front-loaded. Approximately 70% of final brain size was achieved by age 3. After that point, brain growth slowed dramatically even as the body continued growing. This pattern differs from humans, where the brain continues significant growth into adolescence, but matches patterns in other great apes. The early brain development suggests that basic cognitive abilities and learning capacity were established early, even though behavioral sophistication took years of practice to fully develop. Wear patterns on juvenile teeth told stories about diet transitions. The youngest juveniles showed no tooth wear, indicating they were still nursing. Slightly older individuals showed wear patterns matching soft fruits and young leaves, foods that required minimal processing. Adolescent specimens showed wear patterns matching tough vegetation, indicating a gradual transition to the full adult diet. This gradual dietary shift probably reflected both physical development, jaw muscles strengthening, digestive system adapting, and learned knowledge about which foods were appropriate and how to process them. Some juvenile specimens were found in close association with adult females, suggesting they died together in the same event. These associations provide evidence of mother-offspring bonds persisting years beyond infancy. One particularly poignant find included a female skeleton with a juvenile of approximately 4 years positioned adjacent to her torso, in a location suggesting the young individual had been clinging to the mother when they died. Whether death came from flooding, volcanic gases, or some other sudden disaster, the pair remained together, providing a fossilized snapshot of the intense bonds that probably characterized Oreopithecus' social life. The implications of prolonged childhood are significant for understanding Oreopithecus' intelligence and social complexity. Extended juvenile periods evolve only when the benefits of learning outweigh the costs of remaining dependent. Those costs are substantial. Juveniles consume resources without contributing fully to group survival. They're vulnerable to dangers, and they require adult attention that could be directed elsewhere. For selection to favour such extended childhood, the learned behaviours must provide crucial survival advantages that couldn't be acquired through instinct or rapid maturation. Oreopithecus was apparently learning complex skills that required years of practice: how to navigate its three-dimensional wetland environment, how to identify and process diverse foods, and how to navigate social relationships within the group. This learning suggests cognitive flexibility and behavioural sophistication unusual for a Miocene primate, the forests that made a monster. 8 million years ago, Tuscany was unrecognisable. No rolling hills covered in vineyards, no medieval villages, no cypress trees marking ancient farm boundaries. Instead, the landscape was a humid, subtropical swamp where water dominated everything. The air hung thick with moisture, and vegetation grew in chaotic abundance wherever solid ground could be found. This was the world Oreopithecus inhabited, and understanding this alien environment is crucial to understanding why evolution produced such a bizarre creature. The climate was significantly warmer than modern Tuscany. Global temperatures during the late Miocene were several degrees higher than today. Subtropical conditions extended far north of their current range, bringing weather patterns more typical of modern Southeast Asia than Mediterranean Europe. Monsoon-like rains drenched the island during wet seasons, swelling rivers and submerging vast areas under shallow water. Dry seasons brought partial relief, but even then, the landscape remained humid and prone to flooding. The vegetation reflected these conditions. Fossil pollen grains preserved in sediments revealed the dominant plant types. Palms were abundant, particularly species adapted to standing in water, like modern palm swamps. Ferns grew in thick understories beneath the palms, creating nearly impenetrable tangles. Mangrove relatives lined the coastal areas, their stilt-like roots creating mazes above the waterline. These weren't quite true mangroves. The modern mangrove family hadn't yet evolved, but earlier relatives had already discovered that design, evolving roots that could breathe in oxygen-poor mud and tolerate salt exposure. The trees themselves were different from anything alive today. Many belonged to now extinct families or genera that disappeared during later climate shifts. Some combined features we'd now consider incompatible: deciduous leaves that dropped seasonally but growth patterns typical of evergreen rainforest trees. Others had bizarre adaptations to the flooded environment: hollow stems that provided buoyancy, adventitious roots that emerged from trunks to find solid substrate, flowers that bloomed during dry seasons and produced fruits during floods to aid seed dispersal through water. The understory was dominated by dense growths of vegetation adapted to low light and high moisture. Ferns, cycads, and early flowering plants competed for any available light that filtered through the canopy. Some plants evolved climbing strategies, using thorns or adhesive roots to ascend towards sunlight. Others grew as epiphytes, perching on tree branches to escape the flooded ground. The result was a three-dimensional jungle where every vertical layer supported different plant communities, each providing different food resources for animals capable of reaching them. Seasonal patterns shaped the entire ecosystem. During wet seasons lasting roughly 6 months, water levels rose dramatically. Rivers overflowed their banks, creating vast shallow lakes across lowland areas. Islands of slightly higher ground became critical refuges where animals concentrated. Competition for these refuge areas intensified as floodwaters rose. Oreopithecus's ability to wade through water gave it advantages during these floods. It could access feeding areas that other primates couldn't reach, moving between flooded groves by walking through chest-deep water rather than swimming or waiting for levels to drop. During dry seasons, the landscape transformed. Floodwaters receded, exposing vast mudflats that baked hard under intense sun. Rivers shrank to narrow channels snaking between exposed banks. The palm swamps became more accessible, and previously flooded forests opened up. But resources became scarcer as drought progressed. Trees dropped leaves to conserve water, reducing available browse. Fruits became rare as plants entered dormancy. Animals faced lean times, surviving on whatever foods remained available: bark, roots, dormant seeds, perhaps aquatic vegetation from the diminishing waterways. Volcanic activity punctuated the normal seasonal cycles with irregular catastrophes. The island sat on a geologically active crust, with magma chambers relatively close to the surface. Eruptions varied from small events that dusted the landscape with ash to massive explosions that blanketed the region in meters of volcanic debris. Ash layers preserved in the fossil deposits range from millimeters to several meters thick, indicating events of widely varying intensity. The largest eruptions would have devastated local ecosystems, killing vegetation and forcing animals to migrate or face starvation. But volcanic activity also brought benefits. Fresh ash weathered quickly in the warm, wet climate, releasing minerals that fertilize soil. Areas recently affected by ash falls often showed explosively rapid plant growth once rains resumed. These volcanic disturbances created patchy landscapes where some areas had mature forests, others had young regrowth, and still others were barren ash fields just beginning revegetation. This patchwork provided diverse habitats that may have increased overall ecosystem productivity by creating many ecological niches. The waterways themselves were complex ecosystems. Rivers and streams carried nutrients from the volcanic highlands down to coastal swamps, creating productivity gradients. Near the headwaters, clear, fast-moving streams supported different species than the slow, sediment-laden rivers of the lowlands. The coastal areas, where fresh water mixed with seawater in estuaries, had unique flora adapted to fluctuating salinity. Each zone provided different resources, and animals capable of accessing multiple zones, like the versatile Oreopithecus, had significant advantages over specialists tied to single habitat types. The fossil record captures occasional snapshots of catastrophic events. At several sites, numerous animals are preserved in positions suggesting sudden death. These mass mortality layers probably represent flash floods, volcanic gas releases, or other disasters that killed entire local populations simultaneously. In these tragic deposits, we find Oreopithecus mixed with the giant hedgehogs, strange hamsters, crocodilians, and other members of the ecosystem, a frozen moment showing the community composition when disaster struck. The soil structure, preserved in some fossil deposits, reveals surprisingly poor nutrient content despite the lush vegetation. The volcanic parent material weathered quickly, but didn't produce rich soils. Instead, most nutrients were bound up in living biomass, cycled rapidly through plants and decomposers. This meant that the ecosystem's productivity depended on efficient nutrient recycling rather than accumulated soil fertility. Any disruption to the vegetation, fire, volcanic burial, deforestation, would have caused rapid nutrient loss and slow recovery. Oreopithecus's dietary flexibility would have been crucial during recovery periods when preferred foods were scarce, and animals needed to subsist on whatever plants pioneered the disturbed areas first. The voice that never left fossils. Oreopithecus couldn't leave recordings, and soft tissues like vocal cords don't fossilize, but the skeleton preserves clues about sound production and hearing that reveal surprising sophistication in communication. The hyoid bone, a small, horseshoe-shaped bone that anchors the tongue and larynx, was found in several specimens, providing direct evidence about vocal anatomy. The inner ear structure, preserved in skull interiors, reveals what frequencies Oreopithecus could hear. Together, these fossils sketch the outlines of an acoustic communication system more complex than expected for a Miocene primate. The hyoid bone in Oreopithecus was relatively large and robust, with prominent muscle attachment sites. In modern primates, hyoid size and shape correlate with vocal capabilities. Species with larger hyoids and more complex muscle attachments produce more varied vocalizations. Howler monkeys, famous for their loud dawn choruses, have greatly enlarged hyoids that amplify sound. While Oreopithecus didn't have the extreme modifications seen in howlers, its hyoid structure suggests it was capable of producing louder and more varied sounds than typical for its body size. The thyroid cartilage attachments, where the voice box would have connected to other structures, show that Oreopithecus had a descended larynx. In most mammals, the larynx sits high in the throat, limiting the range of sounds that can be produced. In humans, the descended larynx creates a large resonating chamber that allows complex speech sounds. Oreopithecus didn't have the fully descended larynx of humans, but it was positioned lower than in most primates, suggesting enhanced sound production capabilities. The animal could probably produce a wider variety of calls than most monkeys, though nothing approaching the complexity of human speech. The skull shape affected sound production in another way. The air sinuses, hollow chambers in the skull bones, were unusually extensive in Oreopithecus. These sinuses connect to the nasal passages and potentially function as resonating chambers that amplify and modify sounds. In some animals, large sinuses create distinctive vocalizations. Think of the nasal trumpeting of elephants or the deep resonance of howling wolves. Oreopithecus's sinus structure suggests its vocalizations might have had unusual tonal qualities, possibly lower pitched or more resonant than expected for an animal of its size. This could have allowed long-distance communication through dense vegetation where visual signals wouldn't travel far. The inner ear structure, visible in CT scans of fossil skulls, reveals hearing capabilities. The cochlea, the snail-shaped structure that converts sound waves into neural signals, was relatively large in Oreopithecus. Size isn't everything in hearing, but larger cochleae generally indicate better sensitivity, particularly at lower frequencies. The semicircular canals, which sense head rotation and help with balance, were also large. Together, these structures suggest Oreopithecus had acute hearing and was probably sensitive to low-frequency sound, rumbles, booms, and resonant calls that travel well through dense vegetation. The middle ear bones, the tiny ossicles that transmit vibrations from the eardrum to the inner ear, show interesting features. They were robust and heavily built compared to similar-sized primates. Robust ear ossicles typically indicate specialization for hearing particular frequency ranges or for handling loud sounds without damage. The calls might have had unusual resonance or tonal qualities thanks to the extensive sinus system. Male and female calls probably differed. Sexual dimorphism in vocal anatomy is common in primates, with males typically producing louder or deeper sounds used in territorial defense or mate attraction. The social context makes vocal communication crucial. In an environment where visibility was limited by dense vegetation and frequent fog or rain, sound would have been the primary means of maintaining contact between group members. Mothers and offspring would have needed calls for the young to summon mothers or for mothers to locate wandering juveniles. Adult group members would have needed contact calls to prevent separation while foraging. Males might have used loud calls to advertise their presence to females or warn off competing males. Alarm calls would have alerted the group to the rare but dangerous predators, like crocodiles lurking in the swamps. The lack of large predators on the island might have actually enhanced vocal communication's importance. On the mainland, loud calls attract predators. Advertising your location is dangerous. On an island with minimal predation, the costs of vocal communication drop dramatically. Oreopithecus could afford to be noisy, using sound freely for social coordination, without fearing that every call would summon a stalking predator. This predator-free environment might have allowed the evolution of more complex vocal communication than would be possible for a similar primate on the mainland. The death that took a species. Extinction is usually invisible in the fossil record. Populations dwindle gradually, leaving fewer and fewer remains until finally there are none. But sometimes we can see disasters approaching in the fossils themselves. The last million years of Oreopithecus existence show clear signs of environmental stress, declining diversity, and population squeezed into ever-shrinking habitats. The end, when it came, wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a long, slow decline that left the species unable to adapt when conditions became impossible. The trouble began with changing climate patterns. Around 8 million years ago, global temperatures started a cooling trend that would eventually lead to the ice ages. For subtropical regions, the change was profound. Rainfall patterns shifted, with wet seasons becoming less predictable. Some years brought normal monsoons, others brought drought. The predictable seasonal rhythm that Oreopithecus had adapted to became chaotic and unreliable. Plant communities struggled to adjust, with species adapted to consistent moisture dying out, while more drought-tolerant species invaded. The lush palm swamps that Oreopithecus depended on began shrinking. Tectonic activity complicates matters. The Tuscany Sardinia island was drifting, pushed by the same forces that would eventually create the modern Mediterranean. As it moved, sea levels changed relative to the land. What had been extensive lowland swamps gradually became more elevated, draining as the land rose. By 7.5 million years ago, much of the wetland habitat had disappeared, replaced by drier woodlands. These new habitats favoured different animals, ones adapted to more open conditions rather than the dense, flooded forests where Oreopithecus had evolved. The fossil record from this period shows declining Oreopithecus populations. Sites that previously yielded numerous specimens produce only occasional finds. The geographic range contracted, retreating into the remaining pockets of suitable habitat. Where once Oreopithecus ranged across the entire island, it now survived only in isolated lowland basins where water still accumulated. These refugee populations were small, probably numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands. Small populations face additional problems. Inbreeding reduces genetic diversity, random population fluctuations can cause extinction even without environmental change, and any local disaster can wipe out the entire remaining group. Some specimens from this late period show signs of nutritional stress. Bone growth rings indicate years of minimal growth alternating with brief recovery periods. Teeth show more wear than expected for the individual's age, suggesting animals were forced to eat tougher, more abrasive foods as preferred resources became scarce. A few specimens show pathologies associated with malnutrition. Porous bone suggesting vitamin deficiencies, deformed growth indicating protein limitation during crucial developmental periods. The population wasn't thriving, it was barely surviving, stretched to the edge of viability. Volcanic activity increased during this period as well. The island sat on an increasingly unstable crust, with more frequent eruptions blanketing the landscape in ash. Each eruption destroyed local ecosystems, requiring years for recovery. For populations already stressed by habitat loss and climate change, these periodic disasters may have been more than they could handle. Even if some individuals survived each eruption, the recovery period before the next one kept shrinking. The population never had time to rebuild before the next catastrophe struck. Competition from invasive species dealt another blow. Sea level fluctuations periodically reconnected the island to the mainland, allowing continental animals to invade. Deer, pigs, and other ungulates appeared in the fossil record around 7 million years ago, new arrivals from the mainland that competed with Oreopithecus for food. These invaders were adapted to the drier, more variable conditions that were becoming common. They could migrate if local conditions deteriorated, had larger populations on the mainland to buffer against disasters, and brought new diseases that island species had no immunity against. Oreopithecus, isolated for millions of years, couldn't compete. The last confirmed Oreopithecus fossils date to approximately 7 million years ago. After that, there's nothing. The species vanishes from the record completely. The exact mechanism of final extinction remains unknown. It might have been a particularly severe drought that killed off the remaining population. It might have been a disease introduced by invading mainland animals. It might have been a volcanic eruption larger than any previous one, burying the last refugee habitat under meters of ash. Or it might have been simple bad luck, a small population that happened to have too many males in one generation, or too few births, or a critical food source that failed at exactly the wrong time. What's certain is that Oreopithecus had no evolutionary successors. It wasn't an ancestor to any living primate. When it went extinct, an entire branch of the primate family tree ended. All the unique adaptations, the bipedal wading, the precision grip, the complex teeth, the vocal capabilities, disappeared forever. Evolution's 8 million year experiment in creating a swamp ape ended without producing anything that survived to the present day. The only evidence that Oreopithecus ever existed comes from fossils pressed into stone, the scattered bones of animals that once ruled their island domain but couldn't survive when their world changed faster than they could adapt. The scientific battle that never ended. Few fossil species have caused as much disagreement among scientists as Oreopithecus. From the moment the first bones were described in the 1870s, arguments erupted about what this animal was, how it lived, and where it fit in primate evolution. Those arguments continue today, more than a century later, fueled by new fossils, new analytical techniques, and fundamentally different interpretations of the same evidence. The story of Oreopithecus is as much a story about how science struggles to understand the past as it is about the animal itself. The initial classification attempts were ambitious and wrong. Arthur Keith, examining early specimens in the early 1900s, declared Oreopithecus a proto-human, an early ancestor that showed our lineage experimenting with upright walking millions of years before previously thought. He pointed to the pelvis, the leg bones, and the foot structure as proof. His interpretation made headlines, suggesting human origins were far older and far stranger than anyone imagined. But other scientists immediately objected. They saw an ape, nothing more, a tree dweller that happened to have some superficial similarities to humans through convergent evolution. The debate became heated, personal, and occasionally bitter. Johannes Hürzeler, a Swiss paleontologist, spent decades championing the proto-human interpretation. In the 1950s and 60s, he organized expeditions to Italy, recovering more complete specimens that he believed proved his case. The famous 1958 skeleton, found in a coal mine and preserved in exquisite detail, showed features Hürzeler interpreted as undeniably human-like. The short, wide pelvis, the foot with a partial arch, the teeth adapted for a varied diet. He argued that Oreopithecus represented an early offshoot of the line leading to humans, one that adapted to island life but retained evidence of its hominid heritage. His detailed anatomical descriptions convinced some scientists and infuriated others. The opposition, led primarily by researchers working with African early hominid fossils, rejected Hürzeler's interpretation completely. As discoveries in East Africa revealed true early humans, Australopithecus and related genera, the differences between them and Oreopithecus became obvious. The skull shape was wrong. The brain size was too small. The arm proportions didn't match. Most importantly, the geological timing didn't work. Oreopithecus disappeared millions of years before the earliest confirmed hominids appeared in Africa. The proto-human interpretation required accepting that our ancestors originated in Europe, crossed to Africa, evolved for millions of years, then re-invaded Europe as modern humans, a scenario with no supporting evidence. By the 1970s, scientific consensus shifted away from the proto-human interpretation. New biomechanical analyses showed that Oreopithecus's bipedalism was fundamentally different from human walking. The pelvis, while superficially human-like in shape, functioned differently when all the bone geometry was considered. The foot couldn't generate the push-off force needed for efficient bipedal striding. The knee joint couldn't lock in the extended position that makes human walking efficient. Oreopithecus could walk upright, but it wasn't walking toward humanity. It was walking toward its own unique ecological niche in an isolated island environment. But debates didn't end. They simply shifted. If Oreopithecus wasn't proto-human, what was it? Some researchers argued it was a highly specialized cercopithecoid, the group including modern monkeys like baboons and macaques. The tooth structure showed some similarities, and the overall body plan could fit within the broad diversity of fossil cercopithecoids. Others insisted it was a hominoid, the group including apes and humans, but one that split off very early and evolved in bizarre directions. Still others suggested it didn't fit cleanly into any existing category and might represent an entirely separate primate lineage that originated before the monkey-ape split. Molecular phylogenetics couldn't resolve the issue because DNA doesn't survive 8 million years. Without genetic evidence, researchers had to rely on morphology, the shape and structure of bones. But morphology can mislead, especially in cases of convergent evolution, where unrelated animals evolve similar features in response to similar environmental pressures. Was the pelvis similar to humans because of shared ancestry, or because both lineages independently discovered that pelvic structure works well for upright posture? Without DNA, distinguishing these possibilities remained difficult. New analytical techniques from the 1990s onward brought fresh approaches to old questions. Computer modelling allowed researchers to simulate how different skeleton structures would function during various activities. CT scanning revealed internal bone structure without destroying valuable fossils. Stable isotope analysis provided dietary information. Microscopic analysis of wear patterns showed what foods animals had actually eaten. Each new technique added data, but interpretations continued to vary. Two scientists could analyze the same CT scan and reach opposite conclusions about what it revealed. The current scientific consensus, such as it is, places Oreopithecus as a highly derived hominoid that split from the line leading to modern great apes sometime in the Middle Miocene. It's considered a sister group to the African apes and humans, meaning it shared a common ancestor with that lineage, but diverged before modern groups evolved their distinctive features. The bizarre anatomy reflects millions of years of island evolution in isolation, experimenting with adaptations that would never have been possible or successful on the mainland. But this consensus is soft. Papers still appear arguing for alternative interpretations, and every new fossil discovery has potential to reopen old arguments. The persistence of disagreement reflects fundamental challenges in paleontology. Fossils are incomplete. Preservation is biased towards certain body parts and environments, and we're trying to infer behavior and ecology from static bones. Different scientists weigh evidence differently. Some prioritize skull features, others focus on postcranial bones. Still others emphasize teeth. The same specimen can support multiple interpretations, none definitively provable. Oreopithecus encapsulates these challenges. It's strange enough that multiple interpretations seem plausible, but not complete enough to definitively rule any of them out. The broader lesson from the Oreopithecus debate is that evolution produces outcomes that don't always fit our categories. We want clean classifications. This is an ape, that's a monkey, this one's an early human. But evolution doesn't care about our categories. It produces animals adapted to specific environments, and sometimes those adaptations create combinations of features that seem impossible or contradictory by modern standards. Oreopithecus was whatever it needed to be to survive in Tuscanian swamps 8 million years ago. That it doesn't fit neatly into our taxonomic boxes is our problem, not evolution's. The creature that shouldn't have been possible. Standing at the edge of imagination, Oreopithecus defies every expectation we bring to understanding primates. It walked where it should have crawled, climbed where it should have walked, and survived in environments that should have killed anything like it. 8 million years ago, on an island that no longer exists, evolution conducted an experiment that produced results so strange that scientists still argue about what they mean. The creature wasn't building toward humanity, wasn't failing to be something else. It was simply being exactly what it needed to be in its moment, in its place. The hands that could have built cathedrals never made tools. The legs that could have walked across continents never left their island. The brain that might have pondered its existence never developed language or culture. Oreopithecus was simultaneously tantalizingly close to humanity and completely alien to it. A reminder that evolution produces not progress toward us, but adaptation toward circumstances. In another world, with different island conditions, perhaps it would have been our ancestors rather than Australopithecus. In this world, it became a footnote in primate history, a bizarre experiment that ran for millions of years and then ended without legacy. Yet the fossil bones still speak. They tell of a creature that mastered its three-dimensional world, that raised young through extended childhoods requiring patience and care, that communicated through sounds we'll never hear and moved in ways we struggle to imagine. They reveal an animal that was neither ape nor human, but something uniquely itself. Oreopithecus, the swamp ape that ruled Europe when Europe was unrecognizable, that walked upright through flooded forests 8 million years before humans would do the same on African savannas. The mystery hasn't been solved. New fossils appear occasionally, each one adding details that sometimes clarify and sometimes complicate the picture. Technology improves, allowing analysis impossible in previous decades. But some questions may never have definitive answers. The soft tissues are gone forever. The behaviours are inferred from static bones. The environment is reconstructed from pollen grains and chemical signatures. We're attempting to resurrect a world that vanished millions of years ago, using fragmentary evidence and modern assumptions that might not apply. What remains certain is that Oreopithecus was real, was successful, was strange beyond imagining. It represents one of evolution's wild experiments, a test of how far primate body plans can be pushed in unusual directions. The experiment eventually failed. The species went extinct, but it lasted 8 million years, which is longer than our own species has existed. By that measure, Oreopithecus was more successful than we've been so far. Whether we'll still be here in another 7 million years to match its record remains an open question. In museum drawers and research collections, the bones wait. They've waited for millions of years already, pressed into stone, silent witnesses to a vanished world. Sometimes a scientist takes them out, measures them again, photographs them from a new angle, sees something previous researchers missed. The debates continue, the papers accumulate, and slowly, incrementally, understanding grows. We'll never know everything about Oreopithecus, but we know vastly more than the miners who first found its bones and tossed them aside as curiosities. Each generation of scientists sees the fossils with fresh eyes, brings new techniques, and asks different questions. The swamp ape is gone, the island is gone, the Tuscanian wetlands are gone. But the story persists, carried forward in scientific journals and museum collections, in textbooks and documentaries, in the persistent human drive to understand where we came from and what else might have been possible. Oreopithecus didn't become us, but it could have become something equally remarkable given more time and different circumstances. Instead, it became a ghost, a memory in stone, evidence that evolution's imagination exceeds our own. That perhaps is the most important lesson this uncanny ancient monkey teaches, that the world contains wonders we never suspected, that life finds pathways we can't predict, and that the past was far stranger and more wonderful than the present makes us think possible.